Hey, it is your host, Ashley, with STM's Crime and Paranormal Podcast. Today, we are going to be talking about the acid bath murderer. Now, I don't know if you've heard of him before, but his name is John George Howell, and he was born on July 24th of 1909 in Stamford, Lincolnshire, and grew up in the village of Outwood, West Riding of Yorkshire. So this particular murderer is actually based in Europe. So he was born to a John Robert Howell and his wife Emily. His father was an engineer, and they were members of Plymouth Brethren, which it's a conservative Protestant sect. I'm not sure how you say that. I don't know very much about religion. So his father would actually confine him inside of a 10-foot fence that was put up around their garden to lock out the outside world. John would claim that he would suffer from recurring religious nightmares in his childhood. So John Sr. had said the world was evil and the family needed to keep themselves separate from the rest of the world, which is why he put up that 10-foot fence, is to shield his son from the outside world that he perceived as evil. So John Jr. would develop a higher proficiency at the piano, and he had actually learned this while he was at home on his own. He had really appreciated classical music, and he would go to concerts quite often. So he was kind of, I would say he liked the classical music. He was kind of, I would almost say, not really spoiled, but it seems he was kind of taken care of. His family was religious. They tried to shield him from evil. He learned to play the piano, and, he went to classical music concerts, and he just enjoyed classical music. So he was actually also very smart. He would win a scholarship to Queen Elizabeth Grammar School, Wakefield, and then to Wakefield Cathedral, and he would become a choir boy. Once he was out of school, he became an apprentice to a firm of motor engineers. So after a year, he was then dismissed after he was suspected of stealing money from a cash box. July 6th of 1934, he would then marry a girl that was 23 years old, and her name was Beatrice, which they called her Betty, and her last name was Hammer. Not long after they got married, they ended up getting divorced. So this marriage didn't last long, because in that same year, John was sent to jail for fraud, and Betty would end up giving birth while he was in prison. But she would place their baby girl up for adoption, and then she would leave John. So my guess is she basically left him because, he was in jail. He is now being, he was being charged of fraud. And when you grow up in a family that is very religious and tries to keep you from evil things out in the world, nobody's going to stay around. So I would say by my research that he was actually raised pretty well, maybe too strictly, if that's even a thing. But it seems he was raised in a good home. So you wouldn't suspect this of this guy. So after all of this, John's family would actually ostracize him from there on out. So after he was charged with fraud, they decided that they basically were just going to disown him. So he would then move to London in 1936 and become a chauffeur to William McSwan, who was a wealthy owner of amusement arcades. John also would maintain McSwan's amusement machines, and after he would pretend to be a solicitor named William Cato Adamson, with offices in Chancery Lane, London, Guildford, Surrey, and Hastings, Sussex. He would sell fraudulent stock shares that he would get from the estates of his deceased clients at below market rates. So he was basically a con man. Later on in his scam, he would soon be uncovered by someone who had noticed a misspelled word that was in his letterhead. And the misspelled word was Guildford. So it is supposed to be spelled Guildford. Instead, John spelt it in his letterhead as Guilford. So he totally left out the D in guild. This sent up a red flag for somebody, and he soon got suspected of the fraud. So being suspected of this fraud, he would receive a 4-year sentence for fraud, and then was released just after the start of the Second World War. But he would still continue his fraud and would then be sentenced to several more terms of imprisonment. So it's like he never learned his lesson. He keeps doing this fraud because it's easy money, basically. So John would soon regret that he had even left his victims alive to where they could accuse him, and he would start to become intrigued by a French murderer by the name of Georges Alexandre Serret, who disposed of his bodies using sulfuric acid. So John would experiment while he was in prison with field mice and would learn that it only would take 30 minutes for the body to dissolve. I'm not sure how prison was back then or how it is over there in Europe, but I guess I'm kind of shocked that he had access to sulfuric acid and he was able to do this in prison. But we are also talking about completely different times than we live in now. So later, John would be released from prison in 1943 and would become an accountant with an engineering firm. Soon he would bump into his former employer, William McSwan, in a Kensington pub. McSwan had introduced John to his parents, whom were Donald and Amy McSwan, and William McSwan was actually working for his parents by collecting rent on their London properties, and John would soon become envy of the lifestyle that William had. So on September 6th of 1944, William McSwan would disappear, and John would later admit that he lured him into the basement on Gloucester Road and hit him over the head with a lead pipe, then would put his body in a 40-gallon drum with concentrated sulfuric acid. He would describe in his confession that the fumes from the drum would become so overwhelming and he would have to go outside to get some fresh air whenever he was putting the bodies in the sulfuric acid because it was just overwhelming. So John stated that he had slit William's throat and said, quote, "I got a mug and took some blood from his neck in the mug and drank it," end quote. 2 days later, McSwan's body was almost all the way dissolved, and John would then empty the drum into a manhole. John would say that killing someone and removing all traces of them would give him a feeling of euphoria. So it was almost like killing somebody was a drug to him. And it gave him a sense of euphoria, like almost like pain medicine does to somebody that is addicted to opiates. You get addicted and you get that euphoria feeling. And when you are starting to become immune to that feeling, you need more. So, John told William's parents that their son had went into hiding in Scotland to avoid being called up for military service. So later, John would start to live in McSwain's house and was collecting the rent for his parents now. So it's almost like he killed him to be him, pretty much. So now he's getting everything that William McSwain had. And he would send McSwain's parents letters acting like he was their son to maintain the deception that he had told them about leaving so he wouldn't get called to the military. So William's parents would start to become suspicious and wonder why their son hadn't returned yet since the war was coming to an end. On July 2nd of 1945, he would lure them to Gloucester Road, telling them that their son was back from Scotland for a surprise visit. So once they arrived, he would then kill them by blows to their heads and would dispose of them. John informed the McSwain's landlady that the couple had decided to go to America and would have all their mail forwarded to him. Apparently, this was never questioned at the time, and I guess it wasn't odd. So John then started to steal McSwain's pension checks and would sell the parents' properties for about £8,000 and moved to the Onslow Court Hotel in Kensington. So John had a gambling problem, and by the year of 1947, he was starting to run out of money. So he thought to solve his financial problems, he would find another couple to kill and rob. The couple he found was Dr. Archibald Henderson and his wife, Rose. Please keep in mind, I'm not sure if I'm saying these names correctly. I am trying to say them right, so if I'm not, I apologize. So the couple was selling a house, and John had become interested in it. So he was invited by the Hendersons to their flat by Rose to play the piano for their housewarming party. While at the flat, John would steal Mr. Archibald's revolver and was planning to use it in his next crime. So John would rent a small workshop at the address of 2 Leopold Road, Crawley, Sussex, and would move acid and drums there from the Gloucester Road. And John was also known to stay at the Crawley's Hotel, called the George. On several occasions he would stay there. The hotel was called the George. Sorry. So on February 12th of 1948, he would drive Henderson to his workshop, with Henderson being under the impression that he was going to show him an invention. But when they arrived, John shot Henderson in the head with the stolen revolver and then lured Mrs. Henderson to the workshop, claiming that her husband had become ill, and so he then shot her also. After he disposed of both bodies in oil drums that were filled with acid, he would forge a letter with their signatures, later selling all of their possessions for £8,000, except for their car and dog, in which he would keep for himself. So John would even go as far as to write letters to Rose Henderson's brother, Berlin. Berlin was prepared to go to police, but John managed to convince him that the couple immigrated to South Africa on the grounds that Dr. Henderson had carried out an illegal abortion. So John's next and last victim was Olive Durand Deacon, who was 69 years old and was a wealthy widow of solicitor John Durand Deacon and fellow resident at the Onslow Court Hotel. So John was then calling himself an engineer, and Olive would mention an idea to him about artificial fingernails. So she would propose this idea to John about artificial fingernails. So he would invite her down to the Leopold Road workshop on February 18th of 1949. And once they were inside, he shot her in the back of her neck with a .38 caliber Webley revolver that he had stole from Archibald Henderson. After he would take all of her valuables she had on her, and that included a Persian lamb coat, and then he put her into the acid bath. 2 days later, her friend Constance Lane would report her missing, and John had actually offered to be the one to drive to the Chelsea police station with Constance. So he offered a ride for Constance to go to the police station to file a missing persons report because she had no idea where her friend was. She's been gone for 2 days. So Sergeant Lambourne was immediately suspicious of John. Detectives would soon discover John's record of theft and fraud and would then search the workshop that he had rented. Police found a small case that contained a dry cleaner's receipt for Mrs. Durand Deacon's coat and also papers that were referring to the Hendersons and McSwains. So they found stuff that was these people that are missing. So the workshop he rented in Sussex didn't contain any floor drains like the one at the Gloucester Road in London did. So he would then just dispose of his victims' remains by pouring the containers out on a rubble pile at the back of the property. So pathologist Keith Simpson would reveal 28 pounds of human body fat, part of a human foot, human gallstones, and part of a denture that was later identified as Mrs. Durand Deacon by her dentist during the trial. So John asked Detective Inspector Albert Webb when he was being questioned. This is what he asked, quote, "Tell me, frankly, what are the chances of anybody being released from Broadmoor?" End quote. Broadmoor was a high-security psychiatric hospital. So Albert Webb would tell him that he could not discuss that sort of thing. So John would reply, to that by saying, quote, "Well, if I told you the truth, you would not believe me. It sounds too fantastic to believe," end quote. So John would confess that he had killed Durand Deacon, the McSwans, the Hendersons, as well as 3 other people. When he confessed to Detective Inspector Albert Webb, he stated, quote, "I've destroyed her with acid. You'll find the sludge that remains at Leopold Road. Every trace has gone. How can you prove murder if there's no body?" End quote. He then would tell them about the McSwains and Henderson, claiming that he had killed them so he could drink their blood. So there was 3 other people that John had claimed to killed. One of them was a young man named Max. Another was a girl that was from Eastbourne and a woman from Hammersmith. But they were not able to substantiate these murders, so he was not charged on these 3 murders. John's trial was held at loose assizes and would plead insanity, stating that he had drunk the blood of his victims. So John would say that he had dreams dominated by blood as a young boy, and when he was involved in a car accident in March of 1944, his dream of this would come back to him. He said, quote, "I saw before me a forest of crucifixes, which gradually turned into trees. At first, there appeared to be dew or rain dripping from the branches, but as I approached, I realized it was blood. The whole forest began to wreathe, and the trees, dark and erect, to ooze blood. A man went from each tree catching the blood. When the cup was full, he approached me. 'Drink,' he said, but I was unable to move." End quote. The Attorney General, Sir Hartley Shawcross, KC, would lead the prosecution and would urge the jury to turn down John's defense of being insane because he had acted with malice aforethought. Sir David Maxwell Fife, Casey, whom was on the defending end, would call a lot of witnesses to attest to John's mental state. One of the witnesses was Henry Yellowlees, who had claimed that John had a paranoid constitution and added, quote, the absolute callous, cheerful, bland, and almost friendly indifference of the accused to the crimes which he freely admits having committed and unique in my experience, end quote. John had mistakenly believed that if the bodies of his victims could not be found, a murder conviction would not be possible. So basically he believed no body, no conviction. They couldn't prove anything. However, it only took 17 minutes for the jury to find him guilty, and Mr. Justice Travers Humphreys would sentence him to death. On August 10th of 1949, John had drank a brandy right before being hung by executioner Albert Pierpoint. John claimed that he had killed 9 people, but was only convicted of killing 6, which the other 3 we mentioned earlier, but there was no evidence, nothing, absolutely nothing found that he murdered these 3 people. So they were not able to charge and convict him of those murders. So to end this with an interesting fact, John had actually had a girlfriend by the name of Barbara Stevens. She stuck by him for 5 years and had actually intended on marrying John. So somehow John was able to hide this dark side of himself to her, and she would say she had no idea any of this was going on, and that if she did know or had ever found out, he probably would have gotten rid of her also. So during this time, he had a girlfriend that loved him, stuck by him, and he hid this from her. He hid this from her, and she had absolutely no idea. So it just goes to show that some people can grow up in a good family. As far as we know, John grew up in a good family. I couldn't find any evidence that he didn't, although he was very sheltered. But it goes to show that you can grow up in a good family and still do bad things. And that people, you don't always know a person. This girl was with him for 5 years and had no idea that this side of him even existed, which is really scary. And to be honest, I was in a marriage like that also. I thought I knew somebody, and it turned out I absolutely did not know this person. This is about the murder of John Howell, and his nickname was the Acid Bath Murderer because he put them in acid after he killed them to get rid of their bodies. So I hope that you guys have a great morning, great evening, night, afternoon, wherever you are in this world. Stay safe, and I hope you join us on the next podcast.